for Timmins James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to rise, and I'll be sharing my time with the member for Courtenay Alberni. On the question of how public money is spent or misspent is a fundamental question of an obligation for parliamentarians, because the Canadian people don't need to pay attention to everything that happens in Parliament, but they need to know that there's accountability and that we respect their hard-working money being spent properly and through the right channels. I have, Mr. Speaker, many years of experience in this House dealing with all the smut and corruption files that have come along. I was elected in my first year as the Liberal government was telling us that Jean Chrétien's golf balls were going to keep the country together. Fortunately, the Canadian people didn't believe that. That was the first scandal I was involved in. I've lost track of all the scandals, and you can take misspending and put them into various categories. There's simply the tawdry ones, like Bev Oda, every time she went traveling, seemed to rack up as many bills as possible until people finally got fed up. There was Mike Duffy and Nigel Wright, where Mike Duffy was claiming all kinds of outrageous claims because he was a bagman and raised money for the Conservatives. And we were presented with this bizarre case that it was okay to offer a secret bribe, but it was a problem to receive the bribe. But you know that those scandals didn't just belong to the Conservatives. There was Mac Harb, the Liberal, who had this amazing grifter scheme where he wasn't eligible for travel, so he bought this dodgy little cottage, broken down cottage, just 100 kilometers outside of Ottawa, because if he lived 100 kilometers outside of Ottawa, he could hit up the taxpayer for all kinds of travel, even though I was told there wasn't even running water at this cottage. And Mac Harb had to pay back $231,000. And people deserve to be outraged by that abuse, and it raised questions in the Senate. Where is the accountability to make sure the people who are there are doing their jobs? I mean, I remember Tony Clement and the $50 million that was taken out of border funds so he could buy sunken boats and build a fake lake in Muskoka, and that was abusive process. You know, that wasn't criminal, it was an abusive process. There was Arthur Porter, one of the more concerning scandals that I've been involved in over the years, because Stephen Harper appointed him head of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service and made him a Privy Councillor. And we now, of course, then found out that he was involved in what CBC said was the largest fraud investigation in Canadian history, and he ended up dying in Panama in a jail. So those are elements of criminality, griftership, tawdry, people just misusing the public funds. The ArriveCam thing, I think we need to put it in perspective of the time and then analyze it from there. When we were hit with the pandemic, we were dealing with completely unknown, an unknown crisis that none of us had faced. And there was certainly a need to get a response out the door quickly. And who did the best job at that was actually our public servants, when they basically spent that Easter weekend in 2020 creating a program to get the CERB dollars out to people who were not able to work and keep them going. It was the public service who did good, amazing work during that time. But there were a number of scandals that came up during that period, and I think ArriveCam fits into that because it's a question of the lack of oversight and accountability. Certainly, Canadians deserve to know how contracts were $59.5 million divided up through 32 companies for a program that didn't work was allowed to go ahead. We ask ourselves, how was that possible? And I would like to share with my colleagues some of the recommendations that came out of the Ethics Committee that looked into some of the other elements. We looked at the Baylis Medical, we looked at Palantir, and we looked at the Kielburger brothers. Because at the time, again, the government wanted to get a youth program out, and there was $500 to $940 million that was set aside for the Kielburger operation without competition, without a very clear oversight. And what the committee found was that the incredible access that Mark and Craig Kielburger had into the inner workings of government gave them that advantage that no one else had. Certainly, I would encourage any of my colleagues to read the Ethics Commissioner report on the former Finance Minister, Bill Morneau. It makes for a pretty shocking reading that these guys had all access pass into the corridors of the Liberal government, and they weren't even registered to lobby. That certainly was a major factor in bringing down Mr. Morneau. Now, I want to raise this because it's about, if we have these scandals, we need to learn from them. We need to learn how money was misspent. We need to learn why there was no oversight so that they don't repeat. Otherwise, we become a laughingstock of repetition of failure from insiders, from misuse of public funds, from contracting out. So in the contracting out that was to be done with the We group, I'm going to read what the all-party committee said. This isn't my opinion. This was all the political parties who participated and reported back to Parliament that the committee was unable to find any due diligence reports that actually tested the credibility of the claims made by We Charity. This group had never undertaken a project close to this magnitude, and it remains unclear whether they had the means to ensure students across the country could be put to work with credible results. And yet, they were going to be given initially $500 million. There was no due diligence reports we could find anywhere. And then we found out that the money was going to be funneled to a shell company. A shell company initially set up to deal with some of their incredible real estate holdings. How is it possible that the government of Canada would transfer $500 to $940 million to a shell company? Who was taking the enormous risk then? It was the Canadian people. And again, I'm going to read from the all-committee report. The committee is of the view that the decision of the Liberal government of Canada to sign a contract worth over $500 million with a shell company, We Charity Foundation, is deeply troubling. The We Group stated they used the shell company to limit their liability. In reality, this procedure had the potential risk to put a huge investment of taxpayers' fund at risk because the deal was with a shell company with no assets. I mean, how does a G7 country sign on to something of that concerning? Now, I'm raising this because of the whole thing of ArriveCam, and the Auditor General has not been able to find anything about how the monies were spent. One of the most disturbing facts was that after 10 months of study, we had to report to Parliament that we actually had no idea how the finances of the supposed children's charity worked. 10 months of parliamentary study, and we couldn't tell the Canadian people who controlled their multitude of corporations. We didn't even know all the companies that they controlled. We couldn't tell the difference between their so-called charity work and their for-profit work and the ownership structure. And yet the government, without doing due diligence, was going to sign over $500 to $940 million. And it says here in the report that the committee notes that over 10 months of its study, it was unable to get a clear picture of the financial structure of the We Group. We were unable to ascertain a clear division between how monies flowed through the charitable wing and their for-profit operations. We were denied information on the ownership structure of their multitude of side companies. If the Government of Canada is to sign future contracts or contribution agreements with We Charities or its affiliates or subsidiaries, such clarifications must be required. And I raise that, Mr. Speaker, because we're looking at a very similar thing that happened at ArriveCam. Where was the oversight? Now, this is the other question I'm going to end on here, is that we spent 10 months trying to get the CFO of We just to testify, just to tell us what was happening. We were told that he was not only on medical leave, but if we asked him questions, he had this brain aneurysm that might cause his death. So certainly nobody in Parliament was going to wish someone die under the pressure, but they couldn't come up with anybody else who could explain their very complex financial structure. So we received on May 15th, 2021, a letter from Mr. Lee saying he was too sick, he hadn't been doing any work, he was completely uninvolved. And yet we find that in that period, the state of California, there was a registration renewal in November 2020, which he signed off as CEO, a New York State filing, of which he signed off as CEO, an Internal Revenue Service, 2020, Washington State, all these signed off by Victor Lee, and yet they told our committee that this man was so fragile and sick he couldn't even read documents. We were not in a position to do a criminal investigation, but we had to report back to Parliament a major failure of fundamental accountability. So it comes, does this government learn lessons from what happened with the Wee brothers? Or do we just have to repeat these tawdry, dumbed-down abuses of public funds because the accountability mechanisms that should have been there were ignored and the Canadian taxpayer is on the hook? Thank you very much. I'll be here all week.
Questions and comments?